talk is by Michal Schuldman at University of California at Berkeley, and she's going to be talking about physiological responses of heteromeles of Heteromeles to a naturally occurring spring and fall heat wave. I'm sorry, you have lost Positas college now? I am. Oh, congratulations.
Okay, so this is the field site that I worked at, so you can kind of get an overview of what it looks like, and I'll talk a little bit more about the details. But first I just wanted to talk about plants and heat in general. So as you probably would predict, plants have lots of physiological processes that are controlled by changes in the environment. So, and heat is just one of them. When we think of how temperature affects plants, we often think of seasonal effects, like differences in phenology. So you might predict that if the climate warms, things like flowering or when the fruit sets or when it ripens may shift with that change in temperature. You also might think about temperature's effects on physiological processes on a daily kind of time scale. For example, are photosynthetic rates increasing? Are photosynthetic rates decreasing? Those kinds of scale. So temperature affects physiological processes on really different time scales. And there have been a lot of studies on how temperature affects plant photosynthesis and elevated temperatures too. But almost all of these studies have been on chronically elevated temperatures, so you kind of increase the average temperature in an experiment. And what I was interested in, and this is work for my dissertation, is the effects of extreme events or acute temperature changes, which you would commonly think of as a heat wave on plants. So, heat waves are not well studied, I think, for a lot of reasons. One is that they're really hot, and it's not super comfortable to work in them. But the other is that they're not very well defined, and they're also really hard to capture naturally occurring ones in the field. So, kind of the most common definition for heat waves is at least 3 to 5 consecutive days where the temperature is 5 degrees above what you would predict for those days of the year. And that's the one we went with for this study. So this kind of definition emphasizes seasonal acclimation that plants might have. So for example, a heat wave in January would be a very different actual temperature than a heat wave in the middle of summer, which you might think is important to plants if you think that plants can acclimate to different temperatures. An alternative would be to have an absolute definition of heat waves, which is another completely viable idea, especially when studying a process like photosynthesis. And this would be something like anything above 42 degrees Celsius is a heat wave, because we know that's a temperature that starts to denature proteins and change the photosynthetic apparatus and stuff like that. So heat waves are predicted to increase in length, in intensity, and in frequency across the globe. And in California, there's been some nice modeling work to show that the heat wave season, or when the first heat wave starts and the last one ends, that season will increase. We don't know a lot about if it will start earlier or end later. So for this work, I was really interested in looking at the difference between what happens to a plant if you have a heat wave in the spring when there's lots of water, but the plants haven't acclimated to high temperatures, versus if you have a heat wave in the fall when water availability will be limited, but plants have been living in the hot summer all summer, so maybe they've acclimated to some of those high temperatures. Let's see, I talked about this a little bit, but the physiological implications of a heat wave on a plant can be biochemical, as I just mentioned about different high temperatures can change the photosynthetic apparatus or affect the enzymes involved in photosynthesis, but temperature also affects plants on a biophysical level, so they can do things to regulate their own temperature. So for example, they can close their stomata, or they can open their stomata more to try to cool their leaves through evaporative cooling. So there's lots of different strategies. And some of the strategies that plants use for water stress are similar to what they would use for heat stress. And these two things often occur together. Limited water availability is often co-occurs with high temperatures, typically in California. Now, another component of this work that I was interested in was how heat waves might affect different types of plants. And a lot of plants in California that are in chaparral will resprout after a fire. Or if you just chop their tops off, they'll resprout too, which is what happened at the field site I worked at. But understanding how different types of plants might respond to extreme stress, I think is really important, because these different types of plants make up our landscape, and the landscape may change in the future as we have more fires, with more drought. The amount of shrubs versus resprouting shrubs in a landscape could be very different than it is today. So I looked at shrubs and resprouts in this study. So this work had three main goals. The first was just, there's been almost no work like studying plants in the field during an actual heat wave. So one goal was just do that and see what they do. And then also I wanted to look at spring versus winter, or spring versus fall heat waves, and then shrubs versus resprouts. And I focused on carbon fixation, or a proxy for that, and plant water use. My hypotheses were that in the spring, when there's water available, the plants would either be able to maintain whatever their activity was before the heat wave, or maybe they could even increase it if, for example, they're temperature limited because the temperatures are cool, or they're using water to, let's say, cool their leaves, things like that when water is available. But that in the fall, physiological activity would decline during a heat wave compared to days before a heat wave. So this work was also done at a UC reserve, but it was done at Quail Ridge Reserve. It's located, that dot there is where it is found, on the east side of the Coast Range. And it has a really complex topography of lots of different ecosystems. And our site was located on a ridge top above some chamise chaparral that burned in 2005. And I started this work about 4 years after the burn. So my site, it can be really hard to find a place where you have resprouts and mature shrubs growing together, because resprouts tend to form when a fire comes through, right? So with this study, these resprouts were actually mechanically formed as for a fire break. So I have the effect of sprouting without any actual fire effects. So these plants didn't burn, but just downslope from them, there was a fire where they did burn. But from the fire break, I was able to get a mixture of shrubs and resprouts growing together. So the focus plant for this study was Toyon, or Heteromeles arbutifolia, which most people probably recognize as an iconic California chaparral shrub with beautiful berries, red berries in the fall. And it has really large leaves, which is useful if you're doing plant physiology. So that's one reason I picked it, but I also picked it because I used it for a lot of other work in my dissertation, and it grows in a lot of different environments, and it's a really nice resprouting shrub. Also, it's not super deep-rooted, so I thought that that might help the water effects, be more important to it. And there were these the resprouts here were a little bit different than in some other studies in that they were older. They were 4 to 6 years post-fire. Most other work on resprouts is on younger shrubs. So here's the weather of what we did. You can see that in the spring, we've got the gray line there is the 30-year average. So anything above that average would be considered a heat wave cutoff. So the red dots there are the heat wave days that we looked at. So in the spring, the day was slightly above the 5-degree cutoff, but in the fall, the second heat wave day was pretty far above the cutoff. One thing we found was that here we've got, I did this over the course of a day. We've got spring and fall, the top and the bottom. You can see that in the spring, during the heat wave, which are the black dots, this is the difference between leaf and air temperature. The most important point here is that the leaves were actually cooler during the heat wave, which suggested the plants were doing something to cool their leaves. When we looked at stomatal conductance, or how open the stomata on the leaves were, in the spring there on the left bottom, you can see there wasn't really any difference between before and after the heat wave. But in the fall, we have lower conductance during the heat wave than before the heat wave. So in the fall, the plants were closing their stomata during the heat wave. Another thing I looked at was electron transport rate, which is a proxy for photosynthesis. And one thing we found that was interesting is that during the heat wave, the plants shifted the time of day when they were most active in terms of photosynthesis. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Electron transport rate was higher in the morning. So you can see here, the again, is the white circles, and the heat wave is the dark circles. So for both shrubs and resprouts, during the heat wave, the plants had higher electron transport rate in the morning, and then lower at the end of the day. So when it was hot out, the plants were able to shift when they were most physiologically active. Now, I didn't measure photosynthesis directly, so more research would be needed in order to get at that. And that's quite difficult to do in the field during a heat wave just because the equipment doesn't work that well when it's really hot out. So our data basically suggests that heteromeles during this heat waves that we studied at, they were working within their capacity of what they can handle. These heat waves that I looked at were below the threshold for damage to photosynthetic machinery. So even though they were experiencing a heat wave from the weather definition, they weren't really experiencing necessarily a heat wave from the plant's perspective. So perhaps a larger magnitude heat wave, or maybe a heat wave during a drought year. So this was actually, this fall was pretty wet on average. You might find differences than what we found. But heteromeles and many other chaparral shrubs have a variety of mechanisms that they can use to deal with stress. I mean, they're built for dealing with stress. So they can adjust their water potentials, they have small vessels, they have thick leaves, they have really high leaf angles, which you can see in that photo there. So these plants are built to deal with stress. So when we think about what to do for the future, some ideas that I've come up with from this work is that one is that when you're thinking about disturbance. We did find in the study there were differences on RESPROUTS and SHRUBS even 4 to 6 years after a fire. So that's one perspective that is often not really looked at. And then the next is that for chaparral shrubs in general, or plants that are built to deal with water and temperature stress, thinking about a kind of weather-based definition for stress might not be the best way to go. So what that would mean, though, is you would need for each species to do more research into what is its actual physiological threshold, that if we go past that threshold, then we're worried about what might happen. And one way to determine that threshold would be to measure those, let's say, target species in situ during the hottest parts of the summer, and if you could get really dry years or heat waves, that would be great too. Of course, finding extreme heat waves and extreme drought co-occurring together and having the resources and people available to study that is really hard. So when you're trying to understand how extreme events can affect plant communities, it requires a lot of kind of like luck and resources and all that stuff coming together. And unfortunately, I think that these times when we do have extreme drought and some other extreme event like an extreme heat wave or an extreme fire or anything, those are the times that are maybe the most important for shaping how our ecosystems are going to be affected. So hopefully we can try to put some efforts towards understanding these extreme events co-occurring. And with that, I'd just like to thank my funding sources. I used a lot of UC reserves for my work, and my research, some of my research assistants at the bottom there. So thank you. I have time for one question. Yeah.
So it's sort of two questions, or a question and a comment. One is, I noticed you had the mention of FBFF. Are you planning on doing fluorescent fluorescence?
I did do it.
Did you show that result?
I didn't show that result, and there was no effect really of the FBFF. So I just did that during the fall heat wave. I didn't do it during the spring. All the fluorescence work was fall heat wave only.
There was a study, it's probably 20 years old, Valadares, Kirsty.
Yeah.
And one of the things they were kind of doing is they were noticing that if they had crowding, they were sort of served as a proxy for water stress.
Crowding, like, they worked on seedlings, right? The one that they did with the seedlings?
Not seedlings, it actually is possible that they publish all the data.
Oh.
But they saw that if they had heteromeles in a more crowded environment and a less crowded environment, the ones that were, it started out as shade and sun, but the shaded ones were actually more stressed, and it was turned out to be a water stress.
Mm-hmm.